High in the remote mountains of northern Japan, monks once embarked on a path of devotion so extreme, it blurred the line between life and death. Through years of self-starvation, toxic teas, and silent meditation, they slowly transformed their bodies, preparing to become living Buddhas. This was Sokushinbutsu, the ritual of self-mummification. No embalming, no tombs, just discipline, faith, and the will to transcend. When the final breath left their bodies, they were sealed in stone chambers, seated in eternal meditation. Centuries later, their preserved forms remain, not as corpses, but as sacred icons. But what drives a soul to embrace death so willingly? And what did they hope to find beyond it? High in the northern reaches of Japan, the mountains rise like solemn guardians of another world. Cloaked in cedar forests, shrouded in mist, and battered by snowstorms that sweep down from Siberia, these peaks are more than a geographic barrier. They are thresholds, gateways between the fragile realm of human life and the domain of gods, spirits, and mysteries. To the villagers at their base, the mountains were sources of life and death. Their forests provided timber, their rivers offered fish, but their winters could starve entire families, and their avalanches swallowed homes without mercy. It was in this stark, unforgiving landscape that a spiritual drama unfolded, one that would challenge the very limits of the human body and spirit. The story of the mummified monks, Sokushinbutsu, begins not in temples of gold or courts of power, but in these wild mountains, where silence weighs heavier than stone. The Japanese have long believed that mountains are alive, inhabited by kami, divine presences that watch with indifferent patience. In ancient Shinto, to climb a mountain was to step into the realm of these gods, a dangerous crossing that could bring either enlightenment or destruction. When Buddhism arrived from the continent in the 6th century, the mountains absorbed its imagery of bodhisattvas and Buddhas, merging old Shinto all with new doctrines of liberation. Out of this synthesis was born Shugendo, the way of practice and testing, a rugged spiritual path that demanded its followers, Yamabushi, to leave the villages behind and take up a life among peaks, caves, and waterfalls. The Yamabushi were not monks of gilded halls. They were wanderers, hermits, seekers who made the wilderness their cloister. The Heian period, 794 to 1185, saw the flowering of Japan's courtly culture, but while aristocrats composed poems of cherry blossoms in Kyoto, the Yamabushi walked barefoot across jagged ridges, clothed in little more than rough hemp robes. They believed that to know truth, one must confront nature's extremes. The waterfalls of Mount Haguro became their scripture, icy torrents battering their bodies until skin turned blue. The snowfields of Mount Gassen became their meditation hall, where each breath was a struggle against freezing air. They carried conch shells to announce their presence, but often their only companions were the crows that wheeled above tree lanes. These men were testing not only faith, but flesh. In their conviction, the human body was not an obstacle to enlightenment, but the very crucible where it could be forged. It was within this atmosphere of extremity that the idea of Sokushinbutsu took root. The thought was as radical as it was terrifying. What if the body itself could be transformed into a vessel beyond corruption, a living Buddha that would remain in this world, untouched by decay? To modern ears, it sounds grotesque, but to the Yamabushi, it was the ultimate act of devotion. Where other monks spoke of attaining nirvana after death, these ascetics dreamed of embodying eternity within their very flesh. The mountain would not merely be the site of their meditation, it would be the womb of their rebirth. The path to this transformation was whispered, not shouted. It was never advertised to common villagers, who already regarded the Yamabushi with mingled awe and fear. Instead, it was preserved as esoteric knowledge, passed from master to disciple. The mountains of Yamagata Prefecture, Haguro, Gassen, and Yodono, together called the three sacred mountains of Dua, became the silent witnesses of these undertakings. Pilgrims would occasionally glimpse gaunt figures crossing ridges, eyes hollow yet burning with a strange light, but few understood what those men were attempting. Imagine such a monk at dawn, seated upon a rock ledge above a sea of clouds. His robe is patched, his ribs stark beneath his skin, his hands scarred from years of chopping wood and grinding roots. He is not a man seeking comfort. He is a man stripping himself layer by layer, burning away hunger, desire, fear, until only purpose remains. Around him, the forest breathes with life, cicadas in summer, the hush of falling snow in winter. But within him, a silence grows deeper than any season. He is preparing not just for death, but for a death unlike any other. The Japanese landscape shaped the Sokushinbutsu path in ways subtle and profound. Unlike Egypt's deserts, where dry heat naturally preserved corpses, Japan was humid, its summers steaming, its winters damp with snowmelt. For a body to resist decay here required more than chance. It demanded intention, preparation, and a transformation that blurred the line between biology and spirituality. The Yamabushi believed that by consuming only roots, bark, and resin, they could slowly leach fat and moisture from their tissues, creating a living body already halfway to mummification. By drinking poisonous teas brewed from lacquer tree sap, they could saturate themselves with natural toxins that repelled insects and bacteria. Each day was a step towards self-preservation through self-destruction. The villagers whispered of such monks with reverence. They brought offerings to mountain shrines, asking for harvest blessings, safe childbirth, or healing from disease. When they learned that some Yamabushi sought to remain forever in their mountains, never rotting, never vanishing, they saw it as proof of divine power. To kneel before a Sokushinbutsu was to kneel before a man who had defied death itself. Yet the awe was tinged with fear, for the image of a man seated eternally in lotus posture, skin dried to parchment, eyes closed in unending meditation, was both holy and uncanny. At night, fires flickered in village huts, and elders told stories of monks who vanished into the mountains never to return, until, decades later, someone would open a stone chamber and find him still there, untouched, waiting. These tales spread along roads and markets, and soon pilgrims journeyed from afar, carrying coins and incense to lay before these living Buddhas. The Sokushinbutsu were not seen as relics of the past, but as guardians of the present, their silent bodies mediating between the suffering of villagers and the mercy of higher realms. The mountain, then, was not just geography. It was a theater, a temple, and a tomb. Its mist hid the suffering of monks, its stones cradled their final resting places, and its forests echoed with the footsteps of pilgrims seeking hope. Every shadowed cave, every hidden glen might conceal the remnants of one who had dared the impossible. And in this way, the legend of Sokushinbutsu was not confined to one monastery or one sect, but became part of the living mythos of northern Japan. The chapter of Sokushinbutsu begins, then, in the shadow of the mountain, a place where the boundary between life and death was as thin as a mist drifting between cedars. It begins with men who believed that the human body could be more than a vessel fated to rot. It could become eternity itself. And as the snow settled silently on their shoulders, these monks prepared to cross the threshold where few would follow. Long before the Mummified Monks of Japan became silent guardians of their temples, their path was carved by centuries of spiritual blending. The Japanese spiritual landscape has never been one of clean boundaries. Instead, it is a river where many currents meet: Shinto, Buddhism, Taoism, and folk belief, all flowing together, eroding the stones of tradition until something new and uniquely Japanese emerged. At the heart of this convergence lay the discipline of Shujendo, the way of practice and testing, a system of mountain asceticism that would give birth to Sokushinbutsu. To understand why men chose to transform themselves into living mummies, one must first understand the roots that nourish their conviction. Shinto, the indigenous belief of Japan, revered nature as sacred. Every tree, river, and rock could host a kami, a spirit whose presence demanded reverence. Mountains, towering and remote, were especially holy. They were places where human beings felt small, where storms could shred fragile shelters and avalanches could bury entire lives in seconds. To climb a mountain was not recreation, it was pilgrimage. The Japanese saw mountains as thresholds between the human world and the realm of the divine. This sense of awe infused later practices, for to dwell in the mountains was to live among the kami themselves. Into this landscape arrived Buddhism in the 6th century, carried from China and Korea. With it came vast new cosmologies, bodhisattvas who delayed their enlightenment to save others, cycles of rebirth shaped by karma, and scriptures that spoke of nirvana as an escape from the wheel of suffering. Japanese monks absorbed these teachings but did not abandon their native faith. Instead, they merged them. The mountain kami were reinterpreted as manifestations of Buddhas. A peak like Mount Gassen could be both the dwelling place of a Shinto god and the body of a cosmic Buddha. Such syncretism was not contradiction but enrichment, layering meaning upon meaning. Another current flowed into this mix: Taoism, introduced from China. Taoist alchemy emphasized harmony with the natural order, breath control, fasting, and even experiments with elixirs of immortality. Its imagery of transformation, of refining the body into something transcendent, resonated deeply with Japanese seekers. Taoist influence can be traced in practices like dietary restriction, the use of herbs, and meditation in caves, all of which later became part of the Yamabushi discipline. In Taoism, the human body was not simply mortal clay. It could be refined into something enduring, even eternal. This idea found fertile soil in Japan. The result of this blending was Shujendo, a path demanding both physical endurance and spiritual devotion. Its practitioners, the Yamabushi, believed that enlightenment was not reached solely through scripture or temple rituals, but through direct confrontation with nature's extremes. The waterfall became their scripture, its pounding roar drowning thought until only breath remained. The blizzard became their teacher, reminding them of the fragility of flesh and the necessity of inner fire. The forest was their cloister, where silence taught lessons no sutra could capture. Shujendo was not for the timid. It was a crucible for those who sought transformation beyond the ordinary. Within Shujendo, asceticism was not punishment but purification. To deprive the body was to peel away illusion. Hunger revealed the fleeting nature of desire. Cold revealed the limits of endurance. Pain revealed the mind's capacity to transcend flesh. The Yamabushi spoke of cultivating jinriki, spiritual power, that came from pushing the body past its ordinary boundaries. Such power was not selfish. It was meant to heal the sick, bless the harvest, or protect the community from disaster. The Yamabushi were wanderers, but they were also servants, intercessors who carried the strength of the mountain back to the villages below. Among the many disciplines of Shujendo, one stood out as the most extreme: Mokujikijyo, the tree-eating practice. This was the dietary path that would eventually make Sokushinbutsu possible. The Yamabushi who undertook it renounced all grains, meats, and cultivated foods. Instead, they consumed what the mountain offered: nuts, roots, pine needles, bark, and seeds. Over years, this diet stripped the body of fat and muscle, slowly desiccating it. The goal was not merely survival but transformation, creating a body that was lean, dry, and less susceptible to decay. In later centuries, some would add poisonous teas brewed from lacquer tree sap, a substance that would saturate their tissues with toxins. Insects and bacteria would recoil from such flesh. The Yamabushi believed that by emptying themselves of worldly nourishment, they were filling themselves with divine essence. Yet, even within Shujendo, the idea of Sokushinbutsu was not for every practitioner. Most Yamabushi trained in rituals of fire and water, in meditation and healing, and then returned to their villages as protectors. But a rare few believed that the ultimate act of devotion was to offer not just one's prayers or deeds, but one's body itself. They looked to the Mahayana ideal of the Bodhisattva, who vows to delay personal liberation in order to aid all sentient beings. What greater sacrifice could there be than to surrender the body entirely, transforming it into a permanent presence of guidance? The philosophical foundation of Sokushinbutsu lay in this radical compassion. The monk did not seek death as an escape. Instead, he embraced it as a doorway to eternal service. If his body could remain uncorrupted, it would stand as a living sermon for centuries. Pilgrims could kneel before him, feel his presence, and be reminded that enlightenment was not an abstract promise but a tangible reality. The pain of starvation, the poison of lacquer sap, the isolation of a stone chamber, All these were endured not for self, but for others. This conviction echoed through the mountains like the sound of the conch horn, a call few would answer, but none could ignore. Historical records suggest that the practice of Sokushinbutsu flourished particularly in the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, when stability and peace allowed spiritual experimentation. Temples in Yamagata became centers of this discipline, their monks following step-by-step manuals of ascetic training. Yet even before this, the seeds were present. From the earliest days of Shijindo, the mountains whispered of a path where the body itself could become immortal, not through magic, but through endurance. The Yamabushi were heirs to this whisper, and some carried it to its terrifying conclusion. To outsiders, such devotion could seem madness. To starve oneself intentionally, to drink poison willingly, to sit in darkness until breath ceased. Was this not self-destruction? Yet to the Yamabushi, it was the opposite. It was the highest affirmation of life's sacredness. By turning the body into an indestructible relic, they were ensuring that their compassion would not fade with their heartbeat. They were sculpting eternity out of their own flesh. In this way, the roots of asceticism in Japan were not merely about personal salvation. They were about presence, permanence, and service. A temple could burn, a scroll could be lost, but a monk who became Sokushinbutsu remained, seated in lotus posture, forever embodying the faith he had lived. The roots of this conviction grew deep, nourished by Shinto awe, Buddhist compassion, Taoist transformation, and the relentless discipline of Shijindo. And from those roots would grow a practice that defied both life and death. The stage was now set. The mountain had been sanctified, the philosophy articulated, the practices refined. All that remained was for a man of flesh and blood to step into the path, to test the boundaries of human endurance, and to attempt the impossible, to become a living Buddha by becoming his own tomb. To understand the monks who chose the Sokushinbutsu path, one must imagine a life lived on the edge of the elements. Before a body could be sculpted into eternity, it had to be tested, stripped, and purified by fire, water, wind, and stone. The Yamabushi believed that enlightenment could not be found solely in the chanting halls of a temple or in the stillness of meditation cushions. It had to be seized through confrontation with nature in its most merciless forms. Theirs was a creed of ordeal, and its rituals were designed to forge the body as much as the spirit. Among these rituals, water was the most immediate and visceral. Misogi, the practice of purification through cold water, took many forms. Immersion in icy rivers, standing beneath pounding waterfalls, or dousing oneself repeatedly with buckets of frigid spring water. In the mountains of northern Japan, where snow lingered into late spring, this was no symbolic cleansing. A monk would kneel beneath a roaring cascade, bare-chested, while gallons of freezing water hammered his skull and shoulders. The shock of cold stole his breath, the force bent his spine, yet he remained, chanting sutras through clenched teeth. The body screamed for warmth, for escape, but the mind was commanded to endure. This was not punishment, but revelation. In the torrent's relentless strike, thought dissolved, leaving only raw awareness of breath, of pain, of being. Fire was the second great teacher. The Goma ritual, inherited from esoteric Shingon Buddhism, involved the burning of wooden tablets inscribed with prayers. Flames leapt skyward in temple courtyards, crackling like the voices of gods. Monks would chant mantras while feeding the fire, believing it consumed impurity and transformed suffering into light. But beyond the ceremony, Yamabushi also trained with fire more directly. Sometimes holding candles near their flesh, sometimes fasting near blazing pyres, learning to endure heat as they had endured cold. Fires symbolized transformation, the alchemical blaze that could reduce illusions to ash. To walk the Sokushinbutsu path, one had to become both the fuel and the flame. The forests and caves of the mountains offered further trials. Many Yamabushi practiced seclusion in dark hollows where silence pressed like a physical weight. Days stretched into weeks with no company but insects and the occasional drip of water from stone. In that darkness, hallucinations arose, visions of demons, gods, or the restless dead. To conquer such terrors was to conquer the mind's illusions. Some would emerge from caves gaunt and wild-eyed. their hair matted, their bodies trembling, but their gaze steady with newfound clarity. These retreats hardened the will. A man who could sit unmoving in a cave while hunger clawed his belly was one step closer to sitting unmoving in a tomb of stone. Diet, too, was ritual. The Yamabushi did not simply fast. They reshaped their relationship with food. At first, they renounced meat and grains, consuming only wild plants. Over years, they tightened the circle, narrowing their intake to roots, pine needles, and nuts. This regimen, Mokujikijio, the tree-eating practice, not only reduced the body but tuned it to the rhythm of the mountain. To eat bark was to consume the mountain's very skin, to take its endurance into oneself. Some historians suggest that this diet also helped monks achieve a state of semi-mummification even before death, drying the tissues and making decay less likely. Whether this was conscious biochemistry or spiritual symbolism mattered little to the Yamabushi. What mattered was the transformation, the shedding of all that tied them to ordinary life. Breath itself became a tool of transformation. Yamabushi practiced long chanting of mantras, synchronizing breath with sacred syllables. Hours of repetition in mountain shrines or beneath waterfalls turned lungs into bellows and minds into instruments of rhythm. Breath was heat in the cold, stability in terror, the bridge between body and spirit. By mastering breath, a monk could extend endurance beyond what seemed humanly possible. The landscapes themselves shaped the trials. Mount Haguro, lower and more accessible, with its 1,000-stone steps and towering cedars, was often the first stage, a place of initiation. Mount Gassan, snowbound much of the year, tested stamina with its brutal climbs and biting winds. Mount Udono, with its hot springs and blood-red stones, was seen as the most sacred, a site of final revelation. To traverse all three, the Dua Sanzan, was to enact a symbolic cycle of death and rebirth. Pilgrims undertook this journey in hopes of renewal. Yamabushi undertook it as rehearsal for eternity. Each ordeal carried symbolic resonance. Water cleansed, fire transformed, caves revealed truth, fasting purified, breath sustained. Together they forged a body that was not merely strong but sanctified, a body emptied of attachment and filled with presence. For the Yamabushi who would become Sokushinbutsu, these practices were not optional. They were essential steps in preparing for the ultimate ritual of self-mummification. One did not simply sit in a stone chamber and hope to endure. One trained the body as a warrior trains for battle, except the enemy was not an external foe but decay itself. Historical accounts describe Yamabushi walking barefoot across snow, sleeping without blankets, or meditating for days in waist-deep icy rivers. These were not spectacles performed for others, but private wars fought against weakness. The victories were quiet. Another hour beneath the waterfall, another day without food, another night endured in darkness. Each small triumph became a brick in the fortress they were building, the fortress of endurance that would one day hold them through death. Yet endurance alone was not the goal. The Yamabushi sought transformation. They believed that by mastering the elements, they were aligning themselves with the cosmic order. To withstand cold was to merge with winter's kami. To withstand fire was to merge with the flames of purification. To dwell in darkness was to merge with the womb of the earth. Each practice dissolved the boundary between self and world, until the monk was no longer a separate man, but a vessel of universal truth. Sokushinbutsu was the logical extension. If the self was dissolved, why should the body decay? If the monk had become one with the eternal, should not his flesh remain eternal as well? For villagers, the Yamabushi's practices were both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Farmers might see a monk meditating half-naked in the snow and whisper that he was more than human. Children might be warned not to follow such men into the woods, for fear they would vanish into the other world. Yet when crops failed or illness spread, villagers turned to the Yamabushi, believing their suffering had given them powers to heal or intercede with the gods. The rituals of fire and water were thus not private asceticism alone. They were acts of service, generating spiritual merit that could be shared with the community. As centuries passed, the Yamabushi's training became systematized. Manuals described the stages of practice, from waterfall purification to prolonged fasting. But the essence remained the same: confrontation with the elements until the body itself became elemental. Only then could a monk hope to undertake the final, most extreme ritual. Sokushinbutsu was not the beginning of their path, but its culmination, the last step in a long journey through fire and water. The mountain had tested them. The rivers had beaten them. The flames had seared them. The caves had swallowed them. And yet, the Yamabushi endured. What remained was a body already half-emptied, a spirit already half-transcendent, a man poised on the edge between mortality and eternity. The next chapter of their ordeal would not be in open air, but in confinement, not in roaring water, but in silence. The tree-eating practice awaited, the slow and deliberate reshaping of flesh into something that could defy decay. To walk the path of Sokushinbutsu was to undertake a transformation more radical than any human could imagine. The Yamabushi did not simply prepare for death, they reshaped their very flesh in anticipation of it. At the heart of this transformation was a practice called Mokujikijyo, literally tree-eating discipline. This was no symbolic metaphor, but a literal, daily act of survival and devotion. Through it, monks sought to refine the body into something beyond decay, planting the seeds of their eventual self-mummification. In the world of the Yamabushi, food was never merely sustenance. It was attachment, weight, a tether that bound man to the ordinary cycle of hunger and desire. To free oneself from this cycle was to rise closer to the realm of the Buddhists. Thus, the first step of Mokujikijyo was renunciation. The monk abandoned rice, wheat, barley, and millet, the 5 grains that sustained ordinary people. He turned his back on meat and fish, which bound him to the cycle of killing. Instead, he sought nourishment only from what the mountain offered without slaughter: roots, nuts, berries, pine needles, and bark stripped from trees. The Yamabushi lived not as farmers or hunters, but as foragers, like the spirits of the mountain itself. The immediate effect of this diet was emaciation. Fat melted from the body, muscle thinned, and bones jutted beneath skin. But this was no accident. To the Yamabushi, fat was corruption, a storehouse of moisture that fed decay after death. The less fat the body carried, the more likely it was to resist the rot of the grave. Slowly, the monk transformed his body into something dry, sinewy, a vessel of survival against time. The process was not quick. Monks endured this regimen for years, often 1,000 days or more. Each day was an ordeal. Hunger gnawed constantly, yet the monk welcomed it as a companion. His stomach became a drum that reminded him of impermanence. When his hands trembled from weakness, he reminded himself that even trembling was proof of transformation. Villagers might see him wandering, collecting chestnuts or scraping bark, and whisper that he was not entirely human anymore. They were not wrong. In the later stages of training, some monks took the discipline further still. They brewed teas from the sap of the urishi tree, known today for its use in lacquerware. This sap was toxic, capable of causing rashes and poisoning. To drink it was to court death, yet in small doses it served a purpose. It saturated the monk's tissues with toxins, making his flesh unpalatable to insects and resistant to microbial decay. The price was agony, stomach cramps, vomiting, gradual poisoning. But the monks accepted this as necessary. Their bodies were no longer their own. They were being offered to eternity. From the outside, this regimen might look like slow suicide. But to the Yamabushi, it was the cultivation of a sacred state. Each bite of bark was not simply survival, but sacrament. Each sip of toxic tea was not recklessness, but offering. To them, the body was soil in which a new form of existence was being planted. By emptying it of worldly nourishment, they believed they were planting the seeds of transcendence. Historical records suggest that the practice of Mokujikijyo could last nearly a decade. The 1,000-day cycles of training were markers, each period bringing the monk closer to readiness. During these years, he continued to perform the other disciplines of Shujendo: immersion in icy waterfalls, fire rituals, cave meditations, but his body grew steadily more skeletal. His face hollowed, his skin stretched taut over bones, and yet his eyes shone with an intensity that unsettled villagers and inspired disciples. He was no longer a man preparing to die. He was a man rehearsing eternity. The suffering was immense. To chew bark day after day, to feel one's teeth loosen from malnutrition, to feel one's stomach rebel against bitter resins. These were not experiences to be romanticized. They were brutal realities. Many monks died during the process, their bodies too fragile to endure. When this happened, disciples buried them with honor, acknowledging their intent even if the transformation was incomplete. Failure was not shame, but testimony to the extremity of the path. Yet those who survived the long ordeal emerged as beings unlike ordinary humans. Their bodies were dry, their pulses faint, their presence austere and haunting. The villagers who encountered such men often described them with awe. To see a monk thin as a skeleton yet walking upright, his skin the color of ash, his voice a whisper yet filled with conviction, was to glimpse something beyond mortal strength. Pilgrims began to believe these ascetics carried supernatural powers. A touch from such a monk could heal, a blessing from his hand could protect, a prayer in his voice could reach the ears of the gods. The transformation was not only physical but social. The monk became a living threshold, half in this world, half in another. The symbolism of Mokujikijio was profound. Trees, with their deep roots and enduring trunks, symbolized longevity. By eating bark and nuts, the monk was metaphorically consuming the resilience of the mountain itself. He was becoming tree-like, rooted in place, resistant to decay. In Buddhist cosmology, trees were often symbols of enlightenment. The Bodhi tree beneath which the Buddha sat, the cosmic tree that connected worlds. To live by trees alone was to align one's body with this sacred axis. The Yamabushi were not starving themselves in vain. They were becoming living embodiments of cosmic endurance. Yet even as the monk dried his body and poisoned his tissues, he nurtured his spirit with mantras and meditation. He was not simply reducing himself to a husk. He was filling himself with the intention of compassion. The point of Sokushinbutsu was never self-glorification. It was service. By transforming into a mummified Buddha, the monk believed he would remain as a guiding presence for generations. His desiccated form would inspire pilgrims, protect communities, and embody the truth that enlightenment could be achieved through devotion. It is difficult for the modern mind to grasp this conviction. To starve oneself deliberately seems a denial of life. To drink poison willingly seems madness. But within the framework of Mahayana Buddhism, where the Bodhisattva vows to sacrifice personal liberation for the sake of others, such acts were not absurd. They were radical affirmations of compassion. The monk was offering not only his life, but his body, sculpting it into a beacon for those who came after him. As the years of Mokujikijio passed, the monk became less and less a participant in ordinary village life. His days were spent in solitude, his diet inedible to most, his presence unsettling to those who met him. Yet within his hollowed chest, faith burned like a coal. He was convinced that each bite of bark was one step closer to Buddhahood, each sip of poison one step farther from corruption. He was no longer simply preparing for death. He was rehearsing permanence. At last, when the body was sufficiently transformed, lean, desiccated, saturated with preservative toxins, the monk stood on the threshold of the final ritual. He had stripped himself of comfort, family, food, and health. All that remained was to strip away breath itself. The next stage would take him into the earth's embrace, the stone chamber where he would sit in lotus posture, chant until his voice faded, and offer himself entirely to silence. The seeds of transformation had been planted. Through bark, nuts, and poison, the monk had turned his body into a vessel prepared for eternity. Now the question was whether the mountain would accept the offering. To outsiders, the practice of self-mummification might seem like a grim obsession with death. Yet to the Yamabushi who pursued Sokushinbutsu, death was never the final destination. Rather, the ultimate goal was transformation into a living Buddha, a figure who could remain present in this world as an eternal guide. This ideal was not born from despair, but from a profound devotion to Mahayana Buddhist compassion, the vow to remain among the suffering in order to offer salvation. To understand why a monk would choose starvation, poison, and burial alive, one must grasp the luminous vision of the living Buddha that animated every step of the journey. In Mahayana Buddhism, the highest model of spiritual achievement is not the solitary sage who slips into nirvana but the bodhisattva, the being who renounces final liberation to save others. The bodhisattva vows to postpone personal escape from the cycle of birth and death until every sentient being is liberated. This vow requires infinite patience, infinite compassion, and infinite endurance. For the Japanese Yamabushi, the Sokushinbutsu path was an extreme expression of this vow. To transform one's body into an indestructible presence was to fulfill the bodhisattva ideal in flesh, offering not just words or rituals, but a permanent embodiment of guidance. The idea of the living Buddha also drew from earlier Buddhist traditions of relic veneration. In India, the cremated remains of the historical Buddha were enshrined in stupas, where pilgrims traveled to make offerings. These relics were seen as conduits of blessing, physical links to the enlightened one's presence. In East Asia, this practice expanded to include the remains of great teachers, whose bones or ashes were believed to retain spiritual power. Sokushinbutsu was a natural extension of this reverence. Instead of leaving relics by chance, the monk deliberately crafted his own body into the ultimate relic. Whole, visible, seated in meditation, pilgrims would not need to imagine the enlightened presence. They could see it with their own eyes. To the Yamabushi, this was not grotesque, but profoundly beautiful. The preserved body in lotus posture was a sermon without words, a visual scripture. It proclaimed that enlightenment was not confined to myths of the distant past or to the rarefied halls of great monasteries. It could be achieved here, in the mountains, by men of flesh and blood. The living Buddha was proof that devotion could carve eternity out of mortality. But the philosophy went deeper still. In esoteric Shingon Buddhism, which influenced Shujendo, the doctrine of Sokushinbutsu, becoming a Buddha in this very body, was central. This teaching declared that enlightenment was not only possible after countless lifetimes of rebirth, it could be attained in the present, through the body one already possessed. This radical idea resonated with the Yamabushi. If one could become a Buddha now, why should the body of that Buddha be allowed to decay? Sokushinbutsu was the physical manifestation of this doctrine. The monk who succeeded became a literal proof of Sokushinbutsu, a Buddha in this very body, persisting long after the heartbeat ceased. The villagers who encountered these living Buddhas did not see corpses. They saw protectors. Pilgrims carried their burdens, illness, grief, poverty, to the shrines where Sokushinbutsu sat. They knelt before the serene, dried faces and prayed for relief. Many believe that the monk's presence safeguarded harvests, healed the sick, or protected against disasters. In times of famine, villagers sought solace in the silent Buddhas, convinced that their endurance infused the land with resilience. These preserved figures became more than personal achievements. They became communal guardians, embodying compassion for generations. The living Buddha ideal also reflected Japan's broader religious imagination, where the boundary between life and death was fluid. Ancestors were not gone but present, their spirits guiding families. Deities were not distant but manifest in rocks, trees, and rivers. Within this worldview, the idea of a monk remaining after death was not strange but consistent. The Sokushinbutsu were ancestors and deities combined, human yet transcendent, silent yet powerful. Still, the transformation was not guaranteed. Many monks who attempted the path failed to preserve their bodies. When disciples opened the stone chamber after 3 years and found only a decayed corpse, they did not condemn the monk. They believed the attempt itself was meritorious. But when the body was discovered intact, skin leathery, posture serene, the community proclaimed it a miracle. The monk was no longer a man. He was a living Buddha, evidence of the impossible made real. Such moments deepened faith, reinforcing the belief that devotion could defy even the natural laws of decay. This vision of the living Buddha also carried an implicit challenge. It demanded that ordinary people reconsider their own relationship with mortality. If a man could transform his death into permanence, what then was death? Was it merely dissolution, or could it be reshaped by will and faith? The Sokushinbutsu embodied this unsettling possibility. Their presence whispered to every pilgrim, life and death are not fixed, and the human spirit may reach beyond the grave. Yet for all its inspiration, the living Buddha ideal also carried shadows. Some villagers whispered of dread when they gazed upon the dried faces of the monks. The empty sockets of their eyes, the rigid stillness of their posture, the aura of otherworldliness. They stirred unease as much as reverence. But perhaps this was intentional. The Yamabushi did not seek to comfort in a shallow sense. They sought to awaken, to confront people with the raw truth of impermanence. The living Buddha was not a gentle relic, but a mirror, reflecting both the fragility of flesh and the power of faith. To the disciples of a Sokushinbutsu, the transformation was also personal. They had witnessed their master's suffering, heard his chanting fade into silence, and waited for years before opening the chamber. To find him preserved was to feel both grief and triumph. Their teacher had not abandoned them. He had remained, not in spirit alone, but in body, seated before them as if still meditating. The disciples would bow, weep, and enshrine him, ensuring that pilgrims for centuries to come could share in the presence that had once guided them. The living Buddha ideal was thus both philosophy and practice, belief and embodiment. It was born from the Mahayana vow of compassion, nourished by relic traditions, and empowered by the esoteric doctrine of Buddhahood in this body. It found expression in the flesh of Yamabushi who endured starvation and poison, and it bore fruit in the faith of villagers who saw in those preserved figures not death, but hope. In modern times, it is easy to reduce Sokushinbutsu to curiosity, to place them in the category of macabre oddities. But for those who lived in the mountains of Yamagata, the living Buddhas were far more than curiosities. They were protectors, companions, and proof that the human will could reach beyond decay. To gaze upon one was to glimpse a vision of eternity crafted not by myth, but by human hands and human suffering. The path of the living Buddha was almost complete. Having purified their bodies through fire, water, fasting, and bark, and having embraced the philosophy of eternal compassion, the monks now faced the final test. To truly embody the living Buddha ideal, they would have to enter the stone chamber, embrace silence, and await the verdict of eternity itself. At the culmination of years of suffering, fasting, and relentless discipline, the monk who pursued Sokushinbutsu reached the threshold of his final act. Everything, the bark stripped from trees, the toxins swallowed with trembling hands, the waterfalls endured, the fire rituals performed, was preparation for this moment. He had reshaped his body into something desiccated and enduring, and now he would enter the earth itself, offering his final breath in the hope of transcending death. It was not simply a burial. It was a ritual of union, a descent into the womb of the mountain, a final embrace by the earth that had both sustained and tormented him. The ceremony of entombment began quietly, often with only a handful of disciples present. Villagers might know what was about to happen, whispering in awe, but the act itself was hidden away in secluded mountain temples or caves. The monk, gaunt and skeletal from years of tree-eating austerities, dressed in his simple robes, would chant sutras as he prepared. His face bore the serenity of one who had accepted suffering as devotion. He was not being forced into the chamber. He entered willingly, as a bridegroom enters the wedding chamber, as a soldier enters the battlefield. His disciples looked upon him with a mixture of grief and reverence. They knew they were witnessing not a death, but a passage. The chamber was small, barely large enough to sit upright in lotus posture. Some were natural caves adapted for the purpose, others stone enclosures built specifically for Sokushinbutsu. A narrow bamboo tube extended from the chamber to the outside, allowing the monk to breathe and providing a fragile link to the world above. This tube was the last connection between life and death, between the chants inside and the listening ears of disciples outside. Once seated in lotus posture, the monk began to chant the ninbutsu, the invocation of the Buddha's name. His voice was weak, rasping from years of fasting and poison, yet it carried with it the weight of immeasurable conviction. Namu Amida Butsu, he repeated, calling upon the boundless compassion of Amida Buddha. His disciples sat nearby, their ears pressed close to the earth, listening. As long as the chanting continued, they knew their master still lived. Days passed in this vigil. The monk's voice grew weaker, punctuated by long silences as his body strained against starvation. Outside, the disciples maintained their own discipline, chanting, fasting, keeping watch. They did not intervene. Their role was not to save, but to witness. To rescue their master would have been to betray his path, to pull him back from the threshold he had chosen. Instead, they honored his suffering by allowing it to continue, trusting that his intention would carry him through. Eventually, the chanting stopped. The bamboo tube grew silent. At first, disciples waited, straining for the faintest sound of breath, but none came. Only the stillness of the mountain remained. With heavy hearts, they removed the bamboo tube, sealing the chamber completely. Their master was now alone, embraced by stone and darkness. They marked the spot with offerings and prayers, and then departed. But this was not the end. The entombment was only the beginning of another vigil, one that stretched not for days, but for years. Tradition dictated that disciples wait 3 full years before opening the chamber. During this time, they performed rituals for their master's soul, reciting sutras and making offerings, trusting that he remained present in spirit. Yet beneath their prayers lay a profound uncertainty. Would the body remain preserved, transformed into a living Buddha? Or would it decay, leaving behind only bones and dust? The 3-year vigil symbolized the patience of faith. It was a recognition that enlightenment could not be rushed, that the judgment of eternity required time. In those years, villagers would visit the temple, whispering of the monk entombed in silence. Some claimed to dream of him, his face serene, his presence radiating comfort. Others believed his spirit wandered the forests, guiding hunters or protecting crops. The monk's physical fate remained hidden, but his spiritual presence was already felt. When the waiting period ended, disciples gathered with solemn hearts. They approached the chamber with offerings of incense and flowers, chanting as they removed the stones sealing it. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of earth. Slowly, they revealed what lay within. If the body had decayed, they bowed and offered prayers, declaring that their master had still achieved merit through his devotion. But if the body remained intact, skin leathery, posture unbroken, features preserved, they cried out in awe. Their master had achieved Sokushinbutsu. He was no longer a man but a living Buddha, a presence that defied death. The preserved monk would then be carefully cleaned and dressed in robes, seated upon an altar, and enshrined in a temple. Pilgrims would come from far and wide to kneel before him, their eyes filled with tears as they gazed upon the silent figure. To them, he was not a corpse but a guardian, a being who had endured unimaginable suffering to remain among them. The chamber that had been a tomb became a shrine, a place of living presence. The symbolism of this final act was profound. By entering the earth, the monk was returning to the womb of nature. By sitting in silence, he was transcending the boundaries of life and death. By being preserved, he was proving that compassion could leave a permanent mark upon the world. The entombment was not a retreat, but a victory, the culmination of years of preparation and faith. Yet, even among believers, there was recognition of the ordeal's horror. To sit in darkness, starving, chanting until breath ceased, it demanded a courage that bordered on the incomprehensible. Some disciples wept as they sealed the chamber, torn between admiration and grief. They knew their master chose this willingly, but they could not escape the human ache of loss. Sokushinbutsu was thus both triumph and tragedy, a miracle that carried the sting of sacrifice. In time, stories of these final entombments spread. Villagers repeated tales of monks chanting until their voices turned to whispers, of disciples listening with tears streaming down their faces, of chambers sealed with incense, smoke rising into the sky. These stories became part of local folklore, ensuring that even those who never witnessed Sokushinbutsu firsthand would feel its power. The image of a monk seated forever in meditation, buried yet present, became a living myth, etched into the cultural memory of Japan. Thus the monk, who had endured fire, water, hunger, and poison, entered the final stage of his journey. Alone in the earth's embrace, he entrusted his body to silence and eternity. His disciples and community could only wait, uncertain whether his body would endure. But whether preserved or decayed, the act itself carried meaning. For to choose such a path was to embody the deepest truth of compassion, the willingness to suffer for the sake of others, to remain in this world not through ease but through sacrifice. And so the chamber closed, the bamboo tube withdrawn, the earth sealing its secret. Inside, a man sat in lotus posture, his lips stilled, his breath gone, but his presence radiating through the soil and stone. For him, death was not an ending but a doorway. For his disciples, the waiting began. The chamber had been sealed. The chanting had ceased. The bamboo tube, once carrying the faint sound of breath, had been withdrawn and replaced with earth and stone. For the disciples of a monk attempting Sokushinbutsu, this moment was not simply the end of their master's life. It was the beginning of their vigil. For 3 years they would wait, their faith tested daily by silence, their devotion measured not in grand gestures, but in the quiet persistence of ritual and remembrance. The vigil was both spiritual and practical. Tradition required that disciples wait exactly 1,000 days, 3 full years, before opening the chamber. This waiting period was more than arbitrary. It was a time in which decay, if it were to occur, would reveal itself. If the body resisted rot for 3 years, there was hope it would remain preserved indefinitely. But this was not only a scientific calculation, it was also a spiritual probation. For 3 years, disciples continued to treat their master as alive in spirit, believing he lingered just beyond the veil, listening to their prayers. Each day began with sutras. Disciples rose before dawn, their robes damp with mountain dew, and gathered at the small altar erected above the chamber. There, incense curled into the air, a fragile bridge between the living and the entombed. They chanted the Heart Sutra and the Ninbutsu, invoking Amida Buddha's compassion. To them, the sealed chamber beneath their feet was not a tomb, but a meditation hall, their master seated silently within, radiating merit to the world. When villagers visited, they too knelt, pressing their foreheads to the soil, whispering prayers into the ground as if their words might seep through the stone. The vigil also served the community. Pilgrims came from distant villages, bringing offerings of rice, vegetables, or coins. They sought blessings from the entombed monk, believing his suffering magnified his power. Mothers prayed for safe childbirth, farmers for good harvests, the sick for healing. In their minds, the monk was not gone but more present than ever, his spirit freed from the distractions of daily life and concentrated entirely on compassion. His absence became presence, his silence became voice. For the disciples, the vigil was a daily exercise in faith. They wrestled with doubts in the long nights when the mountain winds howled and the snow fell heavy. Was their master truly preserved? Or had his body already dissolved into dust? Some felt pangs of guilt for not saving him, for not breaking open the chamber when his chanting faltered. Yet they reminded themselves that to intervene would have been to rob him of his chosen path. Their sorrow was the price of their loyalty. Seasons cycled as they waited. In spring, wildflowers bloomed around the shrine. Villagers hung fresh garlands, and the air smelled of rain. In summer, pilgrims came in greater numbers, the mountain paths alive with voices and footsteps. In autumn, maple leaves blazed red around the temple, a fiery reminder of impermanence. In winter, snow buried the chamber under drifts, forcing disciples to clear a path daily so pilgrims could still approach. Through it all, the vigil continued, unbroken, year after year. The discipline required was immense. The disciples lived ascetically, continuing the practices their master had taught: fasting, meditation, waterfall purification. They considered themselves extensions of his devotion, his hands and voices in the world while he remained silent. Some recorded their experiences in temple scrolls, noting dreams where their master appeared, visions of his face shining with light, or omens of protection that they attributed to his presence. Whether these were illusions born of grief or genuine spiritual encounters, they strengthened resolve. By the second year, the vigil took on a rhythm. The chamber beneath the earth became less a tomb and more a companion. Disciples referred to their master in the present tense, speaking of his ongoing meditation rather than his death. Children who had been infants at the time of entombment now toddled up the shrine steps, learning to bow before the soil. The community grew accustomed to the presence of the hidden monk, treating him as an unseen guardian of the valley. Yet always there lingered the question of the third year. When the chamber was opened, what would they find? Success was not assured. For every monk who achieved Sokushinbutsu, there were others whose bodies decayed despite all preparation. The disciples knew this, and the tension gnawed at them. To find their master preserved would be triumph beyond words. To find him reduced to bones would still be honorable, but it would sting with disappointment. They oscillated between hope and dread, clinging to ritual as their anchor. At last, the 1,000 days approached their end. Excitement and anxiety spread through the temple and village alike. Pilgrims arrived in greater numbers, sensing that they were about to witness a miracle or at least participate in a momentous unveiling. The disciples prepared by purifying themselves with days of fasting and chanting, ensuring their minds were clear when the time came. They gathered tools to unseal the chamber, but treated them as sacred instruments, not implements of excavation. On the appointed day, the air was thick with anticipation. Incense smoke drifted in the crisp morning air as the disciples began to remove the stones sealing the chamber. Every movement was accompanied by sutras, their voices trembling with both fear and reverence. Villagers knelt in silence, children clutching their mothers' sleeves, elders muttering prayers under their breath. The mountain itself seemed to hush, as if waiting for the revelation. When the final stones were lifted and the chamber opened, all eyes strained to see. If the body had decayed, the disciples would bow in acceptance, offering prayers of gratitude for their master's devotion. But if the body remained, skin taut, posture upright, robes intact, then a cry would rise from the crowd, a collective gasp of awe and relief. In that moment, the monk would be proclaimed a living Buddha, his years of suffering crowned with victory over decay. He would be lifted reverently, cleaned, dressed in fresh robes, and seated in an altar where pilgrims could see him for centuries to come. The vigil of waiting thus culminated not merely in discovery, but in revelation. It was the moment when faith was tested against reality, when silence gave way to sight. And whether the outcome was preservation or decay, the act itself carried profound weight. For 3 years, disciples and villagers had lived in the presence of absence, believing without seeing, enduring without knowing. The unveiling was not only about the monk's fate, but about their own endurance of faith. In this way, the vigil of waiting was as much a part of Sokushinbutsu as the entombment itself. It was the community's participation in the monk's sacrifice, their shared discipline of patience and devotion. The monk gave his body, the disciples gave their years. Together, they wove a tapestry of faith that bound the living and the dead, the seen and the unseen. And when the chamber was finally opened, whatever they found, dust or Buddha, the vigil itself had already transformed them. For 3 years they had lived in the shadow of eternity, and that shadow had shaped their hearts. Sokushinbutsu was not only the story of a monk sealed in stone. It was the story of those who waited, who believed, and who carried his silence into their own lives. The vigil ended not with certainty, but with revelation. For every chamber opened, for every body unveiled, there was no guarantee of triumph. Some monks emerged from the stone womb preserved in perfect stillness, their skin leathery but intact, their posture eternal. Others emerged reduced to dust, their bones slumped, their robes collapsing in fragments. The path of Sokushinbutsu was never assured. Even the most disciplined monk, the most rigorous ascetic, could not fully command the outcome. In this uncertainty lay both the terror and the majesty of the practice, its triumphs shining all the brighter for the shadows of its failures. Historical records from Yamagata Prefecture, where Sokushinbutsu flourished, preserve accounts of both kinds of outcomes. The temples of Mount Yudono and the surrounding regions became the crucibles of this discipline, producing some of the most famous living Buddhas in Japan. One such figure was Tetsumonkai, a monk of Churinji Temple, who died in 1829. His story remains one of the most celebrated. Born into a samurai family, he renounced worldly life after killing a man in a duel, seeking penance through the harshest of disciplines. He wandered as a mendicant, eating only what he could forage, until finally undertaking Sokushinbutsu. After years of bark-eating austerity, he entered the chamber and, 3 years later, was found preserved, seated in serene meditation. Today his body remains enshrined, his features sharp and haunting, his presence undiminished by nearly 2 centuries. Another revered example is Shinyokai Shonin of Dainichibo Temple, who entered his chamber in 1783. Local lore tells that he had practiced Mokujikijyo for over 1,000 days, surviving on pine needles and seeds, before sealing himself underground. When his chamber was opened, his body was discovered intact, his robes still clinging to his frame, his face eerily peaceful. Pilgrims flocked to see him, believing that his endurance had infused him with supernatural power. Even today, visitors kneel before him in reverence, their prayers whispered to a man who has not breathed for over 200 years. But for every Tetsumonkai and Shinyokai, there were others whose stories ended differently. Records tell of monks whose chambers, when opened, revealed only decay. Despite years of fasting and poison, their bodies had returned to the earth, leaving behind little more than bones. These failures were not condemned. Instead, they were honored as sincere attempts. Priests declared that even if the body did not remain, the merit of the effort was immeasurable. Still, such outcomes underscored the perilous uncertainty of Sokushinbutsu. It was not mastery of technique alone, but a gamble against time, climate, and fate itself. The reasons for failure were many. Japan's humid climate made natural mummification exceedingly difficult. Unlike the arid deserts of Egypt, where heat and dryness aided preservation, Japan's summers invited insects and bacteria. Its winters soaked the earth with snowmelt. A monk might prepare his body perfectly, yet a change in weather during those 3 years underground could undo everything. Some scholars suggest that soil composition, airflow, and temperature in the burial chamber were critical factors. Others argue that the toxic teas may not always have been effective in saturating the body. Whatever the case, the line between triumph and failure was razor thin. The presence of both outcomes gave Sokushinbutsu its unique aura. If every monk who attempted it succeeded, the practice might have become routine, its miracle diluted by predictability. But because success was rare, each living Buddha was revered as extraordinary, proof of divine favor. Pilgrims gazed upon the preserved monks with awe precisely because they knew how easily the attempt could have failed. The preserved bodies were not only relics, but testimonies to the razor's edge between decay and eternity. For the disciples of a failed attempt, the unveiling was bittersweet. They had waited 3 years in prayer, imagining their master preserved, only to find his body dissolved. Yet they did not despair. Instead, they held funerary rites, honoring his sacrifice. They believed that even without physical preservation, his spirit had achieved enlightenment, his devotion untainted. Some even argued that failure was not truly failure, for the act itself, entering the chamber willingly, chanting until silence, was the highest offering. The outcome was in the hands of the Buddhas, not man. Still, the successes shaped local faith in profound ways. When villagers entered a temple and saw a monk preserved for centuries, seated in meditation, they felt the impossible had been achieved. The living Buddha was not myth or metaphor, but tangible presence. Pilgrims placed coins before the altar, lit incense, and whispered petitions for healing. Mothers touched their infants' foreheads to the monks' feet, seeking protection. Farmers prayed for rain, travelers for safe journeys, the sick for recovery. The preserved monks became more than relics. They became active participants in community life, guardians seated in stillness but radiating compassion. These triumphs and failures also influenced the practice itself. Disciples studied the outcomes, noting which diets, herbs, or burial conditions seemed most effective. In some temples, detailed manuals were compiled, prescribing exact regimens of fasting, tree bark consumption, and poison ingestion. The path of Sokushinbutsu became more codified, though still unpredictable. No matter how carefully prepared, the outcome remained uncertain. This uncertainty itself became part of the discipline, teaching monks humility. Even the most devout could not command eternity. They could only offer themselves to it. The dual nature of Sokushinbutsu, triumph and failure intertwined, gave the practice a haunting resonance. To gaze upon a preserved monk was to glimpse the triumph of spirit over flesh. To hear of a decayed body was to remember the limits of human endeavor. Together, they formed a paradox, the possibility of transcendence alongside the inevitability of mortality. It was this paradox that made Sokushinbutsu both terrifying and inspiring. For the villagers and pilgrims, the living Buddhas who succeeded became centers of pilgrimage, their temples thriving with visitors. For the monks who failed, their memory was still honored, their names inscribed in temple records, their grave sites tended with respect. In both cases, the attempt itself was sanctified. Triumph inspired awe, failure inspired compassion. Both reaffirmed the central truth of Mahayana Buddhism, that intention and devotion matter more than outcome. Today, the preserved bodies of Shinyokai, Tetsumonkai, and a handful of others remain visible in temples across Yamagata. They sit in glass cases, dressed in robes that have been replaced over the centuries, their faces darkened but serene. Pilgrims still kneel before them, pressing hands together, whispering prayers. Few recall the names of those who failed, yet their presence lingers in temple records and village lore, reminding us that behind every triumph were countless attempts, countless sacrifices. Sokushinbutsu was never a path of certainty. It was a wager against time and decay, a vow that even in failure carried meaning. The triumphs became legends, their bodies preserved for centuries. The failures became lessons in humility, their dust returning to the earth they had sought to transcend. Both together formed the full truth of the practice. The living Buddha ideal was glorious, but it was built on a foundation of human fragility. And it was this tension between triumph and failure that gave Sokushinbutsu its enduring power. The mountains were the crucible where Sokushinbutsu was born, but its influence reached far beyond those remote ridges. What began as the solitary suffering of monks became a living presence in the lives of farmers, pilgrims, and townsfolk who never set foot on the slopes of Haguro, Gassan, or Udono. For them, the preserved bodies of the living Buddhas were not strange curiosities, but sources of hope, guardians woven into the rhythms of daily survival. The world beyond the mountains did not merely observe Sokushinbutsu, it was shaped by it. To understand the appeal, one must imagine life in rural northern Japan during the Edo period. Winters were long and brutal, isolating villages beneath heavy snow. Summers brought storms, floods, and crop diseases that could devastate harvests. Medicine was limited, famine frequent, and life precarious. In such a world, the presence of a monk who had conquered death offered reassurance beyond words. The villagers who toiled in rice paddies, who buried children lost to fever, who watched the skies in fear of drought. These people found in the living Buddhas a force larger than themselves. A body seated in meditation, unchanged for decades, suggested that there was an order beneath chaos, a permanence beneath impermanence. Pilgrimages soon became central to the relationship between the Sokushinbutsu and the wider world. Temples that enshrined preserved monks became magnets for visitors, some traveling great distances along mountain roads. Pilgrims brought offerings of rice, sake, cloth, or coins, laying them before the silent figure. They touched their foreheads to the floor, whispering petitions, a cure for illness, protection for journeys, fertility for barren fields. In return, they believed the living Buddha radiated blessings. His silence was not absence but presence, a wordless promise that suffering could be endured. For many, the living Buddha became a mediator. Farmers viewed him as a guarantor of the harvest, his endurance thought to strengthen the land itself. Mothers prayed for safe childbirth, placing swaddled infants briefly at his feet. Travelers carried small talismans blessed before his shrine, convinced they would ward off bandits or storms. The preserved monk became part of the invisible infrastructure of daily life, a guardian spirit made flesh. Even local rulers recognized their power. In the Edo period, when stability was prized, feudal lords tolerated Sokushinbutsu because they reinforced social order. A community bound together by faith was less likely to rebel. Temples housing living Buddhas attracted pilgrims, bringing wealth to the region and prestige to the domain. Though the practice was radical, its fruits benefited not only the faithful but the political order that governed them. Yet the presence of Sokushinbutsu was not only practical, it was also deeply emotional. For villagers who had lost loved ones, The sight of a monk who had remained through centuries was a balm. He embodied the hope that death did not erase presence. Ancestors were remembered through seasonal rituals, but the living Buddha was different. He was still physically there, still seated in the same posture, still reminding the living that devotion could bridge the abyss of time. To kneel before him was to feel accompanied, even in grief. Stories circulated that magnified this sense of connection. Some villagers swore they saw the preserved monks open their eyes at night, glowing faintly in the dark. Others claimed to hear voices in dreams, receiving guidance from their still lips. Tales spread of pilgrims healed of fevers, of barren fields turning fertile after offerings were made, of storms diverted when prayers were whispered before the altar. Whether these miracles were true or the natural flowering of faith hardly mattered. They deepened devotion, embedding the living Buddhas into the very fabric of belief. The wider world also viewed the practice with fascination. Travelers from Kyoto and Edo wrote of their journeys to Yamagata, recording the awe they felt before the silent figures. Scholars debated whether the preservation was natural or supernatural. Was it the poison of lacquer sap, the dryness of mountain air, or divine intervention that kept the bodies intact? Some leaned toward science, others toward miracle. Yet all agreed that the sight of a human body seated in meditation centuries after death was unforgettable. The living Buddhas thus became both local guardians and national curiosities. They were invoked in poetry, mentioned in travelers' diaries, and whispered about in tea houses. Their reputation spread beyond the valleys that sheltered them, reaching the ears of city dwellers who might never see them, but who marveled at their existence. Sokushinbutsu became part of the cultural imagination of Japan, a symbol of endurance, a paradox of deathless death. For the disciples and temple caretakers, this wider fame carried responsibility. They maintained the bodies carefully, replacing robes when they decayed, repairing altars, and ensuring that the living Buddhas remained dignified. Rituals were performed to renew their presence, offerings made to sustain their role as protectors. They were not relics left to gather dust, but active participants in the temple community. Generations of caretakers treated them as teachers still alive, bowing before them each morning, seeking guidance in difficult decisions. At the same time, unease lingered among some observers. To gaze upon a preserved corpse was not easy, even for the devout. Children sometimes cried, unsettled by the leathery faces. Outsiders occasionally recoiled, calling the practice grotesque. But even this unease reinforced the power of Sokushinbutsu. Reverence mixed with fear made the presence of the living Buddhas all the more potent. They were not meant to comfort with softness, but to awaken with severity. Their very strangeness was part of their authority. Over time, Sokushinbutsu became embedded in a cycle of pilgrimage, festival, and oral tradition. Villages near the temples prospered from the flow of visitors. Inns sprang up along mountain roads. Merchants sold charms and trinkets. Storytellers recited tales of miraculous interventions. The living Buddhas were both spiritual and economic anchors, shaping the lives of countless people who never attempted asceticism themselves, but who benefited from its fruits. In this way, the monks who had once sat alone in dark chambers, starving and chanting to silence, became central figures in communities far beyond their own lifetimes. Their triumphs were shared by villagers who believed in their guardianship. Their failures, too, were remembered with respect, teaching humility. Sokushinbutsu was not a private ordeal, but a communal inheritance. The world beyond the mountains thus absorbed Sokushinbutsu into its rhythms. Farmers planting rice remembered the living Buddha. Mothers holding newborns whispered prayers to him. Pilgrims trudging through snow carried his presence in their hearts. His body, seated in meditation, became more than a relic. It became a living axis around which ordinary lives turned. Through triumphs and failures, awe and unease, miracles and doubts, the living Buddhas bridged the gap between the solitary suffering of monks and the daily endurance of communities. They proved that even the most extreme asceticism did not vanish into silence, but echoed across generations, shaping not only temples, but fields, homes, and hearts. To stand before a Sokushinbutsu was to feel a clash of emotions impossible to reconcile fully. On one hand, the figure radiated devotion, years of suffering carved into a body that had transcended decay, a silent testimony to faith unbroken by death. On the other hand, the sight unsettled, a human form dried to parchment, eyes hollow, lips drawn back over teeth, robes hanging on a frame of bone. It was sacred, yes, but it was also macabre. The practice of Sokushinbutsu thrived precisely in this tension, suspended between reverence and horror. For the devout, the preserved monk was a living Buddha, embodiment of compassion. His body had defied natural law, proving the depth of his devotion. Pilgrims came weeping with gratitude, believing that his silent presence blessed their harvests and guarded their families. They pressed coins before him, lit incense, touched his withered hands with trembling reverence. To them, there was no corpse in the shrine, only a gateway to the divine. But even among the faithful, there lingered unease. Children clung to their mothers, afraid to look directly at the leathery faces. New pilgrims sometimes recoiled, gasping at the shock of encountering death seated upright. Some villagers whispered that the living Buddhas might stir at night, their eyes opening in the dark, their lips moving in wordless prayers or warnings. Fear intertwined with faith, making the devotion all the more intense. It was not the comfort of a smiling deity, but the awe of a presence that was both holy and uncanny. This ambivalence had always surrounded relics in Buddhism. The bones and ashes of the historical Buddha were revered as sacred, yet they were still fragments of a corpse. To kneel before them was to kneel before death, reimagined as presence. Sokushinbutsu heightened this paradox. Unlike a fragment of bone sealed in a reliquary, the entire human form remained, staring back across centuries. There was no barrier between worshipper and mortality. To pray before a Sokushinbutsu was to confront one's own eventual fate, embodied in dried skin and silent ribs. The psychological power of this confrontation was immense. Villagers who feared famine, plague, or war found in the living Buddhas both reassurance and warning. Reassurance, because here was proof that death could be transcended. Warning, because the cost of transcendence was staggering. Hunger, poison, burial alive. The devotion inspired admiration, but the horror kept it sharp, preventing it from softening into complacency. The living Buddhas demanded respect not through gentleness, but through severity. Foreign observers who eventually learned of Sokushinbutsu reacted with even sharper horror. When word of the practice reached outsiders in the 19th century, many called it grotesque, barbaric, or morbid. Western travelers, steeped in their own traditions of embalming and funerary art, recoiled at the thought of a man willingly starving himself to death and sealing himself alive. Missionaries condemned it as superstition, proof of Buddhism's darkness. Even some Japanese reformers during the Meiji era rejected Sokushinbutsu as embarrassing relics of a feudal past. In their eyes, devotion had crossed into self-destruction, holiness into horror. And yet, the horror was inseparable from its meaning. Sokushinbutsu shocked precisely because it made visible what most wished to avoid. Death is usually hidden, softened by ritual, veiled in coffins and graves. But here death sat in plain sight, unmasked, refusing to vanish. The monks did not hide mortality. They transformed it into presence. The horror was not a flaw, but part of the teaching. To gaze upon a Sokushinbutsu was to be forced into confrontation with suffering, with impermanence, with the raw reality of flesh. For some villagers, this confrontation deepened reverence. They saw in the dried faces not grotesquerie, but endurance. They whispered, "If he could endure this, so can we." The horror became strength. For others, the unease lingered. They avoided looking too long, treating the shrine with reverence, but also distance. This duality, devotion mixed with fear, kept Sokushinbutsu alive in memory. It was not something to be forgotten or ignored, but something burned into consciousness. The monks themselves were not blind to this duality. They knew their preserved bodies would both inspire and unsettle. They accepted this tension as part of their service. For to awaken people from complacency, sometimes beauty is not enough. Sometimes it takes horror to pierce the heart. In their shriveled faces, people saw both the possibility of transcendence and the certainty of death. This dual message gave Sokushinbutsu its power. Even within Buddhist communities, debates arose. Was this truly enlightenment, or an extreme distortion of practice? Some monks admired the discipline, seeing it as the ultimate expression of compassion. Others criticized it, arguing that the Buddha taught liberation through wisdom, not self-destruction. The practice skirted the boundary between devotion and excess, holiness and fanaticism. That boundary was precisely what made Sokushinbutsu unforgettable. The villagers, however, rarely engaged in such theological debates. For them, the living Buddhas were protectors, no matter how unsettling their appearance. They came with offerings, told stories of miracles, and accepted the paradox. In their worldview, life was already filled with contradictions: beauty and suffering, fertility and famine, life and death. The Sokushinbutsu embodied this paradox in flesh. To kneel before one was to kneel before life itself, in all its awe and terror. The ambivalence extended to art and literature. Some poets wrote of the serene stillness of the living Buddhas, likening them to mountains unmoved by storms. Others hinted at the uncanny, describing how their gaze seemed to pierce through time, or how their silence was heavier than thunder. These mixed images reflected the truth. Sokushinbutsu could not be reduced to either devotion or horror. They were always both. And so the living Buddhas endured, preserved not only in skin and bone, but in the tension they evoked. Each pilgrim who approached them brought their own emotions: fear, awe, gratitude, dread, and found them mirrored in the monk's silent presence. Sokushinbutsu did not comfort in the ordinary sense. They unsettled. They demanded attention. They forced people to look directly at what most turned away from. In that confrontation lay their power. Between devotion and horror, between awe and unease, Sokushinbutsu carved their place in history. They became reminders that faith is not always gentle, that compassion can be fierce, and that holiness may wear the face of death. To stand before them was to stand at the boundary of human experience, where reverence and dread are inseparable. For centuries, the practice of Sokushinbutsu had thrived in the secluded valleys of northern Japan, largely untouched by the shifting fortunes of rulers and courts. The mountains had sheltered the Yamabushi, their asceticism tolerated by shoguns so long as it did not threaten the order of society. But no human practice, however secluded, could remain entirely beyond the reach of politics. The winds of power eventually swept into the mountains, and with them came both tolerance and suppression. Sokushinbutsu would endure, but not without scars from Japan's turbulent transformations. During the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, Japan was under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate, a regime obsessed with stability. The shoguns enforced peace through rigid social hierarchies, regulated trade, and controlled religion with careful precision. Yet paradoxically, within this climate of control, Sokushinbutsu found room to flourish. The practice, while extreme, was confined to remote mountain temples. It did not spark rebellion, nor did it disrupt the carefully balanced social order. Indeed, the preserved monks often reinforced local stability by attracting pilgrims, stimulating regional economies, and binding communities through shared devotion. Feudal lords of the Tohoku region, where many Sokushinbutsu resided, recognized their value. A temple with a living Buddha drew visitors, wealth, and prestige to the domain. Thus, while the central shogunate kept religion on a tight leash, requiring all citizens to register with Buddhist temples, suppressing Christianity, and policing heretical sects, it allowed Sokushinbutsu to continue. The monks who starved themselves in stone chambers were not political agitators, but silent guardians. Their bodies, far from threatening the state, bolstered the spiritual fabric of the people. But history is never static. The mid-19th century brought upheaval that shook Japan to its foundations. The arrival of Western ships, most famously Commodore Perry's black vessels in 1853, forced Japan to confront the outside world after centuries of isolation. Foreign powers demanded trade, new technologies poured in, and old ways of life began to tremble. By 1868, the Tokugawa shogunate collapsed, replaced by the Meiji Restoration, a radical project to modernize Japan, centralize power under the emperor, and align the nation with Western models of progress. The Meiji leaders viewed religion not as a matter of private devotion, but as a tool of nation-building. They sought to elevate Shinto as the state ideology, linking it directly to imperial authority. Buddhism, by contrast, was seen as a relic of the feudal past, too closely tied to the old order. In an infamous movement known as Haibutsu Kishaku, abolish Buddhism, destroy Shakyamuni. Temples were closed, monks defrocked, statues smashed, scriptures burned. Though the fervor eventually cooled, the message was clear. Practices that appeared backward or superstitious had no place in a modern nation. Sokushinbutsu, with its dried bodies and burial rituals, fell squarely into this category of suspicion. To Meiji reformers eager to present Japan as civilized in the eyes of Western powers, the image of monks starving themselves into mummification was embarrassing. It clashed with the rhetoric of progress, science, and modernization. Officials declared Sokushinbutsu a superstition, a grotesque distortion of Buddhism incompatible with the new national vision. Laws were passed banning the practice. Monks could no longer legally pursue self-mummification, and temples were pressured to conceal or downplay the bodies they already enshrined. The suppression was not total annihilation. Some temples quietly resisted, continuing to venerate their preserved monks in private. In rural areas, where devotion was deeply embedded, villagers protected the memory of their living Buddhas even if officials frowned. But the climate of fear was real. To be accused of harboring superstitious practices could bring fines, confiscation, or worse. Sokushinbutsu, once a public act of devotion, slipped into the shadows. In some cases, the preserved bodies themselves were hidden. Temples locked them away in back rooms, veiling them from outsiders. Others disguised the enshrined monks as ordinary statues, draping them in fresh robes and presenting them as artistic images rather than preserved flesh. Local caretakers whispered their prayers in secrecy, careful not to attract unwanted attention from inspectors. The living Buddhas survived these years not because the state endorsed them, but because communities refused to forget. Ironically, it was the very horror Western observers expressed that helped spur suppression. Travelers and missionaries in the late 19th century wrote accounts of Sokushinbutsu that emphasized its grotesqueness, presenting it as proof of Buddhism's decadence. In their narratives, Japan's modernization was praised precisely when it stamped out such practices. The Meiji government, eager to align itself with Western approval, leaned into this framing, treating Sokushinbutsu as a relic best erased. Yet devotion proved stubborn. For villagers who had prayed before preserved monks for generations, the state's condemnation did not erase the memory of miracles or the comfort of presence. They continued to tell stories of the living Buddhas, to whisper prayers, to regard them as guardians. Sokushinbutsu endured not as a thriving practice. New attempts ceased, but as an inheritance, preserved in secrecy until a time when they could again be acknowledged openly. By the early 20th century, as Japan solidified its identity as a modern empire, Sokushinbutsu remained banned but not forgotten. Anthropologists, both Japanese and foreign, began to take interest, documenting the preserved monks as cultural artifacts. Scientists examined them, debating whether preservation was achieved through diet, environment, or miracle. In this strange twist, the very modernity that had sought to erase Sokushinbutsu now preserved it as an object of study. The suppression of Sokushinbutsu thus reflected a broader pattern, the collision between ancient devotion and modern statecraft. To the Meiji rulers, progress required discarding what seemed grotesque. To villagers, faith required holding on to what gave life meaning. Between these poles, Sokushinbutsu shifted from public ritual to hidden relic, from active practice to cultural memory. The winds of politics could not entirely destroy it, but they reshaped its place in Japanese life. No longer was Sokushinbutsu a living path pursued by monks. It became instead a legacy, carried in whispers, hidden in shrines, awaiting rediscovery by later generations. The mountains that had sheltered it before now sheltered it again, cradling the silent bodies while the nation around them rushed toward modernity. And so, the living Buddhas remained seated, untouched by laws or reforms, waiting. They had outlasted famine, disease, and decay. They would outlast governments too. For while political winds blew hard, the silence of the Sokushinbutsu was deeper, heavier, more enduring than any decree. When Japan entered the modern age, Sokushinbutsu could no longer remain solely objects of devotion. The preserved monks who once lived quietly in mountain temples were now drawn into the gaze of science and anthropology. What villagers had revered as miracles, and what pilgrims had worshipped as living Buddhas, physicians and researchers began to examine with clinical detachment. In this shift, Sokushinbutsu became a meeting ground between faith and empiricism, between the sacred silence of temples and the sterile scrutiny of laboratories. The question was no longer only spiritual. How could these bodies endure centuries without succumbing to decay? The earliest modern encounters with Sokushinbutsu came during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when scholars of the new Meiji state began cataloging Japan's cultural heritage. Anthropologists, eager to align Japan with the global community of science, studied the preserved monks as ethnographic curiosities. Some dismissed them as examples of superstitious practices that Japan needed to outgrow. Others, however, were captivated, realizing that Sokushinbutsu represented a unique phenomenon: deliberate self-mummification in a humid climate where natural preservation was nearly impossible. Medical examiners soon took interest. Reports from the early 20th century described doctors carefully inspecting the leathery skin, shrunken organs, and brittle bones of the preserved monks. Some suggested that the Mokujikijio diet, the bark, nuts, and resin consumed for years, had stripped the body of fat and moisture, leaving little for bacteria to feed on. Others pointed to the urushi sap, whose poisonous compounds acted as a preservative, saturating the tissues with toxins that repelled insects. Still others emphasized the burial environment. The stone chambers, sealed after years of fasting, created conditions that slowed decay. Yet even with these explanations, the mystery was not fully solved. Japan's climate is notoriously unkind to preservation. Heat and humidity encourage rapid decomposition. For a body to remain intact for centuries without artificial embalming or freezing seemed improbable. Some researchers argued that chance played a large role. Only a few monks succeeded, and their preservation might have depended on rare environmental coincidences rather than ritual precision. The fact that most attempts ended in decay seemed to support this view. And yet, the preserved monks existed, visible, undeniable, seated in temples centuries after their deaths. Science could describe the factors, but not fully explain the phenomenon. Was it simply a matter of chemistry and climate? Or was there something more, something intangible that science hesitated to name? This ambiguity deepened the fascination. Anthropologists published studies, doctors debated, journalists reported, but none could strip Sokushinbutsu of its aura. Instead, the scientific gaze added another layer of intrigue. Pilgrims who once bowed purely in devotion now also marveled at the scientific mystery. The monks became both sacred relics and medical puzzles, bridging worlds that otherwise seemed opposed. Not all examinations were respectful. Some researchers treated the bodies as specimens rather than sacred beings, probing them without sensitivity to their role in local faith. Villagers sometimes resisted, angry that outsiders reduced their guardians to curiosities. For them, no autopsy could capture the devotion that had carved these figures into eternity. To cut into the body of a living Buddha was, in their eyes, an act of desecration. The tension between reverence and curiosity persisted, just as it had when Sokushinbutsu first inspired both awe and horror. Western scholars, too, joined the conversation. Reports circulated in academic journals and travelogues, often emphasizing the macabre. Some compared Sokushinbutsu to Egyptian mummies, noting the stark difference. The Egyptians embalmed their dead after death, while Japanese monks embalmed themselves while alive. Others compared them to Christian relics, the incorruptible saints whose bodies were said to resist decay. In every case, Sokushinbutsu confounded easy categories, belonging simultaneously to science, religion, and folklore. Modern technology brought new insights. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, non-invasive imaging techniques such as X-rays and CT scans were applied to Sokushinbutsu. These scans revealed remarkable details. Organs shriveled but still present, joints intact, tissues dried but preserved. In some cases, The scans showed deliberate preparation, layers of cloth or resin reinforcing the body. In others, they revealed near-complete natural mummification with no external aid. Such findings confirmed aspects of the monks' discipline, but also raised new questions. Why did preservation succeed so rarely? Was the toxic lacquer tea truly effective, or were environmental conditions the decisive factor? Despite the advances, no single explanation sufficed. The mummification of Sokushinbutsu was not purely natural, nor purely miraculous. It was a convergence of factors: diet, poison, burial, climate, devotion, woven together in ways that still elude complete understanding. Even scientists admitted a degree of mystery. As one researcher noted, "We can describe the conditions, but we cannot replicate the will." The devotion required to attempt Sokushinbutsu was itself beyond the reach of laboratory analysis. This unresolved tension gave Sokushinbutsu enduring relevance. For believers, scientific explanations did not diminish the monk's sanctity. If anything, they enhanced it. To endure such austerities and align the body so perfectly with preservation was itself a sign of extraordinary spiritual power. For skeptics, the monks remained fascinating anomalies, proof that human will and circumstance could occasionally create what seemed miraculous. In either case, the Sokushinbutsu stood as reminders that not all mysteries yield easily to reason. The interplay of science and faith also altered how Sokushinbutsu were presented. Temples began to highlight both dimensions, speaking of their monks as spiritual guardians and scientific wonders. Guides explained the diet of bark and lacquer sap, then invited pilgrims to bow before the preserved figure. Museums displayed photographs, anthropologists published studies, but the aura of sanctity remained. Visitors left not with answers, but with questions, their imaginations stirred by the coexistence of devotion and biology. It is important to acknowledge that some accounts of Sokushinbutsu are uncertain. Legends often exaggerated details, attributing miracles that may never have occurred. Some preserved figures were reinforced by later caretakers, adding layers of lacquer or cloth. Scholars caution that not every claim can be verified. Yet, even with these caveats, the core truth endures. Men willingly transformed themselves into relics, and some succeeded in resisting decay for centuries. This information has not been verified. In the end, the scientific eyes did not strip Sokushinbutsu of their power. Instead, they reframed it. What had once been seen only as miracle became also mystery, a puzzle that defied complete resolution. The monks remained both sacred presences and medical enigmas, embodiments of devotion that even microscopes could not fully unravel. Thus, Sokushinbutsu continued to sit in their temples, silent, unchanged, unmoved by theories. Science circled around them. Pilgrims bowed before them, and still they remained. Figures caught between categories, forever resisting reduction to either faith or fact. They were, and remain, enigmas carved by devotion, guardians of both belief and mystery. Behind the stillness of the Sokushinbutsu, behind the leathery skin and silent faces revered in temples, lies a truth too often obscured by reverence. These monks suffered beyond imagination. Their preserved bodies are not only relics of devotion, but echoes of torment. Each hollowed cheek and brittle bone a record of pain endured in service of faith. To kneel before a living Buddha is to kneel before centuries of suffering made permanent. To honor their achievement fully, one must confront the weight of their agony. The path of Sokushinbutsu was, from beginning to end, a gradual crucifixion of the self. It began with hunger, the simplest and most relentless of sufferings. To abandon rice and grain was not a symbolic gesture. It was the stripping away of the staple that sustained Japanese life. Day after day, the monk chewed bark, ground seeds, gnawed roots. His stomach never knew satiety. Hunger gnawed like a constant companion, whispering temptation with every passing villager who ate a bowl of steaming rice. The monks will had to overcome not only desire but the very instincts of survival. Hunger bled into weakness. Muscles wasted, strength dwindled, fatigue became constant. To climb mountain paths while subsisting on pine needles was to carry an invisible burden heavier than stone. Bones ached, joints stiffened, Wounds healed slowly, if at all. Yet the monk pressed on, believing each pang purified him. Each tremor burned away attachment. He accepted weakness as progress, frailty as transformation. But acceptance did not erase pain. Every step was an echo of suffering, carried in silence. The poisoning came next. To drink urushi sap was to drink agony. The toxic tea scalded the stomach, twisted the intestines, burned the throat. Vomiting racked the body, rashes inflamed the skin. The monk endured these torments willingly, knowing that each swallow carried him closer to incorruptibility. His body became a battlefield where poison and devotion wrestled. Pain was not incidental, but central, proof that the process was working. Yet in the stillness of their preserved forms, this torment is invisible. Only imagination can restore it. Isolation deepened the ordeal. To spend weeks in caves, months in solitude, years cut off from ordinary human warmth was its own kind of suffering. Loneliness pressed like stone, echoing louder than waterfalls. The monk's only companions were insects, winds, and the ghosts of his own mind. Hallucinations haunted him, visions of demons clawing in the dark, voices of the dead, dreams that blurred into waking terrors. To resist madness required a strength as great as resisting hunger. In his solitude, every fear was amplified, every doubt sharpened. Yet he sat, chanting sutras to steady his mind, his voice echoing against cave walls that cared nothing for his devotion. And then there was the final chamber. To enter a stone tomb alive was the most excruciating choice of all. Seated in lotus posture, the monk chanted, knowing each word might be his last. His body was already skeletal, his breath shallow, his skin stretched like parchment. But in those final days, every moment was suffering condensed. Hunger raged, thirst burned, muscles cramped from stillness. Darkness pressed upon him, the air heavy and stale. His disciples listened to his chants through the bamboo tube, hearing his voice weaken, falter, fade. Imagine the terror of that silence, the moment when breath ceased but consciousness still hovered. The monk chose to die not in sleep or ease but in raw awareness, every nerve alight with pain. Why endure such torment? Because to these monks, suffering was not meaningless. In Buddhist cosmology, suffering, dukkha, is the first truth, the fundamental condition of existence. To confront it, embrace it, and transform it was to move toward enlightenment. The Sokushinbutsu path turned suffering itself into sacrament. Hunger was not obstacle, but offering. Pain was not curse, but purification. To accept suffering willingly was to align oneself with the Bodhisattva's vow, to endure so that others might find hope. And indeed, the echoes of their suffering did not vanish with death. Villagers who prayed before the preserved bodies drew strength from knowing what those monks had endured. A mother facing childbirth could whisper, "If he bore such agony, I too can bear mine." A farmer watching fields wither could remind himself, "If he endured hunger for years, I can endure one bad season." The monk's suffering was not private, but communal. It became a reservoir of resilience that flowed into the lives of others. Yet one must not romanticize their torment. It was brutal. Bones cracked beneath the strain of starvation. Skin blistered from toxins. Minds wavered on the edge of madness. Some monks died before reaching the chamber, their bodies collapsing in fields or caves. Others decayed after death, their suffering erased from physical memory, though honored in prayer. For every triumphant Sokushinbutsu, dozens suffered in vain, their bodies consumed by earth rather than preserved in shrines. The echoes of suffering include not only the visible figures in temples, but also the countless invisible attempts lost to time. Modern visitors often see only the serene stillness of the living Buddhas. They see calm faces, closed eyes, folded hands. They do not hear the groans of hunger, the retching of poison, the rasp of fading breath. But to honor these figures fully, one must imagine those sounds. One must remember that serenity was carved from torment, peace born of agony. The preserved bodies are not denials of suffering, but its monuments. There is also empathy to be found. To imagine their pain is to connect with them not as distant relics, but as fellow humans. Beneath the robes and myth, they were men with bones that ached, stomachs that growled, minds that feared. Their greatness lay not in being beyond human, but in pushing the boundaries of what human endurance could achieve. They remind us that suffering is universal, and that how one bears it can shape not only oneself, but generations after. The echoes of their suffering also ripple into modern questions. What does it mean to willingly embrace torment for faith? How far should devotion go? When does endurance become self-destruction, and when does it become transcendence? The Sokushinbutsu do not answer these questions, they embody them. Their bodies are riddles posed across centuries, forcing each viewer to wrestle with the meaning of suffering in their own lives. In the end, the silence of the Sokushinbutsu is not emptiness but resonance. It vibrates with the memory of hunger, poison, solitude, and death. To kneel before them is to kneel before suffering itself, not to glorify it, but to acknowledge it, to feel empathy for those who endured it, and to find in their endurance a reflection of one's own. The echoes of suffering remain. They whisper from the shriveled lips of monks seated in lotus stillness. They tremble in the incense smoke that curls before their altars. They linger in the hearts of pilgrims who leave with renewed courage. In those echoes, suffering is not erased but transformed into compassion, into presence, into eternity. Even now, centuries after the monks sealed themselves in stone chambers, their presence continues to draw footsteps to the mountains. The practice of Sokushinbutsu has long ceased, outlawed by the Meiji state, abandoned by temples fearful of suppression. Yet the preserved figures remain, enthroned in wooden halls and glass cases, silent but alive in the faith of pilgrims. Their stillness has become a destination. To journey to a Sokushinbutsu is to walk not only through geography, but through time, entering a space where past suffering still radiates into the present. In Yamagata Prefecture, the three sacred mountains of Dua, Haguro, Gassan, and Udono remain the spiritual heartland of Sokushinbutsu. Here, temples like Dainichibo and Churinji guard their living Buddhas with reverence. The journey to these sites is itself a pilgrimage. Pilgrims climb steep stone steps beneath towering cedars, their roots twisting like veins of the earth, while the sound of wind and water fills the air. At each turn, the landscape reminds them of impermanence, moss devouring stone, streams carving valleys, snow blanketing and melting in endless cycles. The mountains are not mere backdrops. They are participants, the very crucibles that forged the monks who once sat within them. When pilgrims finally reach the temple, they remove their shoes, stepping into wooden halls fragrant with incense. The atmosphere shifts immediately. Outside, the forest is restless, alive with sound. Inside, silence reigns, broken only by the soft creak of boards underfoot and the murmurs of prayer. At the altar sits the Sokushinbutsu, clothed in robes that have been renewed over generations, his posture unbroken, his face austere yet strangely serene. Behind glass, his skin is darkened, leathery, but intact. Centuries of devotion have not erased the details. The curve of cheekbones, the folds of hands, the impression of lips once used to chant sutras. The experience is overwhelming. Many pilgrims weep upon first sight, overwhelmed by the weight of presence. This is not a statue carved by artisans. It is a human being who chose suffering so that others might feel hope. For villagers, the Sokushinbutsu is a guardian. For modern pilgrims, he is also a bridge, linking the fragility of their own lives with the endurance of a body that has survived centuries. Some whisper prayers for health, others for guidance, others simply bow, unable to find words. Rituals surround the visit. Monks of the temple chant sutras, striking wooden fish drums, their voices rising and falling like waves. Pilgrims offer incense, the smoke curling upward as if to carry their petitions into the silent figure. Some bring gifts of cloth, which are used to sew new robes for the Sokushinbutsu. Others leave coins, folded paper prayers, or strands of hair from a sick loved one. Each offering reflects the belief that the living Buddha still acts, still listens, still radiates compassion. The pilgrimage is not limited to the devout. Tourists arrive as well, drawn by curiosity, history, or the allure of the uncanny. They step into the halls with cameras slung around their necks, but many lower them once confronted with the figure. What seemed from a distance like a morbid curiosity often transforms into quiet awe when seen up close. The Sokushinbutsu command reverence not by force, but by presence, their silence heavier than spectacle. Even skeptics leave subdued, their laughter muted, their eyes lingering as if the image had imprinted itself too deeply to dismiss. The pilgrimage also carries layers of symbolism. To climb the mountain is to enact death and rebirth, mirroring the journey of the monks themselves. Each step on the 1,000-stone stairs of Mount Haguro represents a sutra, a prayer carved into the earth by generations of pilgrims. To bow before the Sokushinbutsu at the end is to reach a kind of symbolic culmination. A reminder that endurance, though costly, can yield transcendence. The journey itself becomes meditation, the shrine its revelation. Today, only a handful of Sokushinbutsu remain on public display, most famously Shinyokai Shonen at Dainichibo and Tetsumonkai Shonen at Churinji. Yet these few continue to attract thousands. In them, pilgrims see not only relics but continuity. Despite centuries of suppression, modernization, and secularization, the living Buddhas endure. They are not simply relics of the past, but active presences in the present, witnesses to both the ancient struggles of villagers and the modern anxieties of city dwellers. For many modern Japanese, the pilgrimage is also an act of cultural identity. In a world where tradition is easily overshadowed by technology, to stand before a Sokushinbutsu is to reconnect with a lineage older than the nation-state itself. It is to touch a thread that runs back through centuries of devotion, a reminder that Japan's spiritual heritage is not only in texts and temples, but in flesh that has endured beyond decay. The atmosphere of these pilgrimages is unique. Unlike the bustling energy of major shrines such as Ayase or Kyoto's temples, the Sokushinbutsu sites are hushed, intimate, cloaked in mountain mist. Visitors often describe feeling a chill, not of cold, but of presence. The silence seems alive, as if the air itself holds memory. Each step closer to the preserved monk feels like entering a deeper layer of time. By the time pilgrims kneel before him, they are no longer in the ordinary present, but in a space where centuries converge. The living Buddhas also inspire festivals and local traditions. In some villages, annual ceremonies are held in their honor, where monks chant through the night, villagers bring offerings of food, and children learn the stories of the ascetics who once walked their mountains. These festivals weave Sokushinbutsu into the rhythm of community life, ensuring that even those who never climb the mountains still feel the presence of the living Buddhas in their yearly cycles. For the temples themselves, the preservation of these figures is both sacred duty and delicate responsibility. Robes are changed periodically, their fragile skin inspected with care, the glass cases cleaned but never polished to sterility. Monks bow before them daily, treating them not as artifacts, but as teachers. They whisper prayers before their altars, seeking guidance for the temple's future. Even in the age of electricity and high-speed trains, they maintain the rituals of incense, chanting, and silence, ensuring that the living Buddhas remain what they were meant to be, presences of compassion, guardians of devotion. The pilgrimage of the faithful continues, then, not only as a movement of feet, but as a movement of hearts. To journey to a Sokushinbutsu is to be reminded of endurance, sacrifice, and compassion made flesh. It is to stand before suffering transfigured into hope. It is to feel, in the hush of incense and the gaze of a preserved face, that faith can carve eternity into the fragile clay of human bodies. And so the pilgrims keep coming. Farmers and city workers, mothers and students, tourists and monks. They climb steps slick with rain, tread paths buried in snow, whisper prayers into silence. They come seeking miracles, comfort, meaning, or simply the strange gravity of presence. And when they depart, they carry with them something ineffable, a memory of stillness that lingers long after incense smoke fades. The Sokushinbutsu remain, seated in meditation, while the world beyond shifts endlessly. Yet each new visitor becomes part of the ongoing story, proof that the monk's sacrifice still bears fruit centuries later. The preserved bodies of the Sokushinbutsu sit in silence, centuries old, gazing at nothing yet seen by everyone who comes before them. Their presence is undeniable, Their meaning, however, has never been settled. For some they are miracles, living Buddhas who defied decay through devotion. For others they are tragic reminders of human obsession, men who starved and poisoned themselves in pursuit of an impossible goal. Between these poles lies the eternal question: what, exactly, do the Sokushinbutsu represent? On one level, they embody triumph. Against hunger, time, and rot, they endured. Their bodies remain, seated in meditation, while countless generations have been born, lived, and died. To those who bow before them, they are proof that the human spirit can transcend the limits of flesh. They are symbols of compassion so deep that a monk would embrace torment not for himself, but for others, offering his body as an eternal presence of guidance. The faithful see in them the victory of devotion over impermanence, a miracle carved in bone and skin. Yet on another level, they embody tragedy. To imagine their suffering is to shudder. Years of starvation, the agony of poison, the terror of burial alive. Their silence was not won easily, but wrung from flesh through torment. Skeptics look upon them and see not miracles, but martyrs of extremity, men who destroyed themselves for ideals twisted too far. The question arises: was this enlightenment, or was it self-destruction? Did they conquer death, or did they become prisoners of it, trapped forever in glass cases, their bodies objects of curiosity as much as veneration? The paradox is sharpened by the doctrine that inspired them. In Shingon Buddhism, Sokushinbutsu, becoming a Buddha in this very body, was meant to affirm life, not deny it. The idea that enlightenment could be realized here and now was revolutionary. Sokushinbutsu extended this doctrine to its most radical conclusion. If one could become a Buddha in life, why not remain one in death? But does the preserved body truly embody enlightenment, or only a shell of suffering mistaken for holiness? The question resists resolution. Cultural context complicates the answer further. For the villagers who prayed before them, the living Buddhas were not abstract debates, but tangible guardians. Their presence was practical: blessings for harvests, protection for children, healing for the sick. Whether miracle or biology mattered little. What mattered was the comfort and strength they inspired. In this sense, the Sokushinbutsu fulfilled their vow. They remained in the world to serve others, not as teachers of doctrine, but as presences of resilience. Their meaning was lived, not theorized. Yet from the perspective of modern science, the Sokushinbutsu are puzzles. Scans reveal organs shriveled but intact, tissues desiccated, bones preserved. Explanations abound. Starvation reduced fat, poison repelled insects, stone chambers slowed decay. But science cannot measure devotion, nor can it answer why only some succeeded while others decayed. Was it a chance? Was it chemistry? Or was it something intangible, something science has no language to describe? Each preserved monk remains an enigma, balanced between explanation and mystery. This ambiguity is what gives the Sokushinbutsu their enduring power. If they were easily explained, they would be curiosities, no more. If they were unquestionably miraculous, they would be objects of unquestioning devotion. Instead, they are both and neither. They force each observer to wrestle with the eternal question: what do we believe about death, suffering, and transcendence? Each visitor projects their own answer. Some kneel in reverence, others shudder in unease, still others marvel in detached curiosity. The monks themselves remain silent, refusing to resolve the paradox. The eternal question is not only about them, but about us. What does it mean to endure? What does it mean to sacrifice? What does it mean to remain? The Sokushinbutsu ask whether life's meaning is found in avoiding suffering or in embracing it for a greater cause. They ask whether permanence is possible or even desirable. They ask whether death is an end or a transformation. Their bodies do not supply answers. They supply presence, confronting each pilgrim with the need to decide for themselves. The monk's silence also speaks to the universal human desire to be remembered. To live and vanish is the fate of most, our names forgotten within generations. The Sokushinbutsu refused this anonymity. They carved their devotion into their own flesh, ensuring that centuries later people would still whisper their names, kneel before their bodies, and carry their presence into memory. In this sense, They embody the longing that all humans share, to leave something behind that endures. Yet they achieved it at a cost so high that most recoil. Was the permanence worth the pain? That is the question their bodies ask with every glance. Their presence also echoes beyond Japan. Around the world, cultures have sought to resist decay. The embalmed pharaohs of Egypt, the incorruptible saints of Christianity, the relics of Buddhist masters across Asia, all reveal a common impulse: the refusal to let death erase presence. Sokushinbutsu stand among these traditions, unique in their method but united in their aspiration. They remind us that across cultures, humans have always struggled to reconcile mortality with the longing for eternity. And yet, perhaps their greatest question is not about death, but about compassion. The monks believed they were not dying for themselves, but for others, offering their bodies as permanent presences of guidance. In their suffering, they sought to shoulder some of the burden of a world filled with hunger, disease, and impermanence. Whether one sees this as misguided or noble, it cannot be denied that their intent was selfless. To endure such torment for others is a challenge to every viewer. What are we willing to endure, to give, for those beyond ourselves? Thus the Sokushinbutsu sit, not as answers, but as questions. Their bodies confront us with the limits of human endurance, the ambiguity of faith, the paradox of presence. They are sacred to some, grotesque to others, but to all they are unforgettable. Their silence is not emptiness, but interrogation, asking each of us, what does it mean to live, to die, to remain? The eternal question remains unanswered. Perhaps it is meant to. The Sokushinbutsu are not sermons with clear lessons, but riddles embodied in flesh. They do not resolve the tension between miracle and horror, triumph and tragedy, devotion and madness. They hold the tension century after century, forcing each new pilgrim to step into it. And so they remain, silent, seated, unyielding. The monks who once chewed bark, drank poison, and chanted in darkness are gone. Yet they are still here, staring across centuries. Their presence is proof not of certainty, but of paradox. They endure not because they answer, but because they ask, endlessly, the eternal question. The story of the Sokushinbutsu is not merely the tale of monks who starved and poisoned themselves into mummification. It is the story of the human struggle against impermanence, the refusal to let death erase presence, the longing to leave something behind that endures beyond the fragile span of breath. In their silence, the monks ask questions that belong not only to their mountains and temples, but to all of humanity. When we gaze upon their preserved forms, seated in meditation, faces leathery yet serene, we are not only witnessing devotion. We are witnessing a paradox: life preserved through death, compassion expressed through suffering, permanence sought in a world defined by impermanence. The Sokushinbutsu embody both triumph and tragedy. They inspire awe at what the human spirit can endure, and they provoke unease at what it was willing to endure. They stand at the threshold where faith and horror meet, where reverence and dread mingle. Across cultures, humans have always sought ways to resist mortality. The embalmed pharaohs of Egypt, the incorruptible saints of Christianity, the relics of Buddhist masters, all speak to the same yearning, that death should not sever presence entirely. Sokushinbutsu joined this lineage, but with a unique difference. Theirs was not preservation imposed from outside, but chosen from within. They embalmed themselves alive, transforming their very bodies into relics through willpower and devotion. This choice makes them both unsettling and profound, forcing us to ask how far devotion can, or should, go. Their silence also speaks to compassion. The monks did not endure agony for personal glory. They believed their suffering would benefit others, that their preserved forms would serve as guardians, sources of blessing, reminders of impermanence. Whether we view this belief as noble or misguided, its selflessness is undeniable. In a world where most cling desperately to comfort, their choice confronts us with a radical inversion: the embrace of suffering as an offering of love. For modern eyes, the Sokushinbutsu are also mirrors. They reflect our own anxieties about mortality, memory, and meaning. We may not chew bark or drink poison, but we still wrestle with the desire to be remembered, to leave a mark, to remain present after we are gone. Some build monuments, others write books, others raise families. The Sokushinbutsu reminds us that this longing is universal, and that the forms it takes are as diverse as humanity itself. Science has peered into their bodies, offering explanations of diet, toxins, and burial conditions. Yet even with these insights, the mystery remains. How could frail flesh endure centuries in such hostile climates? How could the human embrace such torment with unwavering resolve? Science can describe, but not fully explain. Faith can revere, but not dispel unease. Between them, the Sokushinbutsu endure as enigmas, neither reduced to miracle nor stripped of mystery. Perhaps that is their final lesson. The Sokushinbutsu are not meant to give us clear answers. They are meant to confront us with questions. What is worth suffering for? What endures after death? How do we transform pain into presence? Their bodies, seated in stillness, do not resolve these questions. They embody them, forcing each pilgrim to carry them away, unanswered, into their own lives. And so the monks remain, silent, unmoving, unchanged, while centuries flow around them. Their flesh has dried, their voices have vanished, yet their presence radiates still. They remind us that suffering can be transformed, that devotion can carve permanence out of fragility, and that the human spirit, in its striving, can reach toward eternity even in the shadow of death. Their silence is not emptiness. It is the silence of stone and flesh, a silence heavy with questions, a silence that endures.